Hello, it's Adam here in the old Coles Brothers department store in Sheffield. It shut down a few years ago, and people were quite annoyed about that here, but it has been reborn this weekend as one of the venues for the Crossed Wires Podcasting Festival. It's the second year this podcast festival has been running, but this is the first year it's been sponsored by BBC Sounds, who are kind of like the sponsors of Newscast. So we thought we would come here and we'd make an episode. And because it's quite a big, echoey room, we thought, we should maybe fill it up with some newscasters. So we have. Do you want to say hello? Hello! So I'm now going to look over at the guys to see if they're ready to play the famous newscast music. I'm going to look to my right to see if Chris Mason and Henry Zeffman, making a rare weekday appearance, are ready. And then I think we should make an episode of Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
He has just compared me to the Fat Controller.
Did I say that? I can't believe I said that. Next question.
This is all for the benefit of Earth. I'm not personally a huge Sabrina Carpenter fan.
I don't think I'm being rude. I like landscapes.
Take me down to Downing Street. Let's go have a tour.
Blimey.
Hello, it's Adam, not in the Newscast studio, but at the Crossed Wires Podcasting Festival.
And it's Chris in God's own county.
Shameless appeal to the audience there. Henry, also very delighted to be in Sheffield.
So, obviously this episode's a little bit different because we actually have some people with us rather than just the three of us sat in a cupboard talking to ourselves, so that's nice. It's also the anniversary of the election of the Labour government with their huge, massive, historic landslide. So we thought for this episode, we would maybe do a bit of a look back at just a few of the little news events of the last year that have comprised the first year of the Labour government. Obviously, we've got loads of newscasters here, so if you've got any questions or observations to make, then maybe we'll be able to throw the microphone out to you guys as well. But before we do that, we have to catch up with this year's best newscast gimmick, Brewscast. Just to confirm, it's brew as in cup of tea, not bruise as in you've been punched, or brew as in real ale. Chris, have you brought a politically meaningful mug to share with us?
Yeah, so I decided, when informed of this particular stunt at the last minute, to go and peruse the BBC Westminster little corner where we can make a cup of tea, because it is a cornucopia of nerdy political mugs. There's one in there from Chris Hume's tilt for the Liberal Democrat leadership. And anyway, in amongst them, it's just a miracle if you find a clean one, but I found a clean one, and indeed one very faded, which says, "Miss me yet?" ? With a picture of George W. Bush.
Do you miss him, guys?
So WWW from the era before social media, still encapsulated on a mug, and perfect for a brew.
I think we need to do some research to find out where that mug would have come from.
Well, so I did.
So it must be like post-2008, obviously.
Just when you were logging into your laptop, you gave me sufficient time.
That's why it took so long.
To peruse the base and see if I could find any dating on it. But beyond badging him as the 43rd president, no, there isn't any. So I suspect at some point someone's done a trip to Washington or whatever and perhaps come back with a mug.
Okay, if anyone knows the provenance, like we're on the Antiques Roadshow, let us know. Henry, what have you got?
I have a Theresa May strong, stable leadership in the national interest mug. And by the way,
you missing her?
This mug has been much more stable than the general election campaign from which I stole it, because it's been through my erratic dishwasher for 8 years now.
Remarkably unfaded, actually.
Yeah, no, I do drink out of it quite a lot, actually. And I remember I stole this from her campaign battle bus on the final day of the 2017 general election campaign, first general election campaign I'd covered. And, it wasn't quite clear how bad the next day would be for her, but it was clear things hadn't gone very well. So basically her team were so ecstatic that everything was over that they just fled the bus. And so I grabbed 3 of these and 4 posters. But then I got I don't know what happened to the other 2. And then I gave them to colleagues. And then I got the tube back through London with for Theresa May's strong and stable leadership posters and realised that actually I couldn't explain to every single one there that no, I wasn't part of the campaign. I was a journalist and I'd taken them as a souvenir. So I think I ditched them halfway through. Anyway.
Henry, no one knows the importance of a strong cup of coffee in the morning better than you with your 4 a.m. starts. What is your caffeine strategy of a morning?
I actually don't have coffee until I've done the Today programme at 6:30. I might have tea if I'm especially tired, but I find somehow not being caffeinated puts me in the right. I don't know. So for some reason, if you mistime the caffeine, you end up too energetic. But it's a work in progress.
And you have Emma Barnett and Nick Robinson for a bit of audio caffeine into your ears at 6:33 in the morning.
It's the only jolt I need.
Now, the last couple of episodes of Newscast, I did do a bit of a shout out and said, oh, if you're coming to see us in Sheffield and you've got a political mug, you could bring it and we'd introduce it on stage. Did anyone get that memo?
Oh, there's a mug.
Someone's put their hand up. Right, Chris is going into the crowd. Chris is going to go into the crowd. This means I now have to fill until Chris gets the mug. The mug is being handed over. Chris is now negotiating with the newscaster about whether he can bring it to the stage. Chris, carry it carefully, like Keir Starmer trying to win an election with the Ming Bas. Right, Chris, do your best radio reporting now. What have you got?
So I'm in possession of a Sheffield Wednesday mug.
Who are they?
What
about Tuesday and Thursday?
Which means, in the interest of BBC impartiality, I've got about half an hour to find a United one.
And also, John Murray from 5 Lives just round the corner, so he could.
£9. Still got the barcode.
Oh, right.
Fantastic. I shall return it to. Do you want
to go and return it? Yeah. Because there's nothing worse than when your mug is stolen from the kitchen. Henry, while Chris is doing that, should we just do a little bit of today's news before we dip into our retrospective? What's this new alternative to the Labour Party that's just sprung up overnight?
Well, it's still a bit unclear, but yesterday evening, Zara Sultana, who was elected as a Labour MP for a constituency in Coventry at the last general election, but actually has spent most of the intervening year as an independent, having been suspended from the Labour Party. She announced that she was now fully quitting the Labour Party. I don't think anyone ever thought she was actually coming back, but nevertheless, she drew that protracted saga to a close, and she said she would be, I can't remember the exact form of words, but she essentially implied that she would be co-leading a new political party with Jeremy Corbyn. Took a while for Jeremy Corbyn to say that he would be co-leading a party with her. In fact, he hasn't quite said that. He said today that he will be involved in co-founding a new political movement with her. Not quite the same thing. So, look, clearly there is something to be worked out there. But I do think what is clear is that there is going to be some force to Labour's left, whether it's in conjunction with or in addition to the Green Party at the next general election. And I think that is potentially a challenge to them, not necessarily to lead the government, but it will be taking votes in one direction for sure.
Yeah, and when we're in this era already, where there is this smorgasbord of support as far as opinion polls are concerned in so many different directions, and it being way beyond the era of the big two Westminster parties, if you throw into the mix, if this vehicle comes into being and Jeremy Corbyn perhaps is a prominent figure with a certain cachet for a chunk of the electorate, then things get even more kind of complicated and fractured. And then you can look at different parts of the political spectrum. Obviously, we've seen not just the rise of Reform, but then the arguments going on within Reform, the whole row involving Rupert Lowe, the guy elected as a Reform MP who now sits as an independent, but he's already talking about his own movement and a movement of people who are, if you like, Reform adjacent, but separate from Reform. And then in an era where you've got, as the opinion polls appear at the moment, Labour and the Conservatives collectively on well short of 40% of the vote combined, when not that long ago a single one of those two could hit that at a general election. And that's just looking at it through the prism of England. If you look in Scotland and Wales, there's an additional factor in terms of the likes of Plaid and the SNP. What an extraordinary political backdrop at the moment.
Although, Chris, while you were doing another podcast today here, a live recording of the shipping forecast, me and Henry were in a well-known Peri Peri chicken restaurant. And every time I go to that particular chain, I think of an upstart political party that did not take off. Do you remember Change UK from a few years ago? Where actually the only thing they actually successfully did was all go to Nando's. So actually, you can start a new party, but that doesn't mean it's going to work.
That's true. That's absolutely true. And traditionally, the first-past-the-post voting system at Westminster has been has made it very, very hard for newer parties, or even longer established parties beyond the main two, unless they had really concentrated geographical pockets of support, to break through. But when you get a splintering, that can begin to change. And when you have big political parties scrapping around in the teens or the low 20s of support, if an upstart comes along and can even manage 4 or 5%, that could potentially be very significant in what it takes away from the bigger names.
And I think the challenge for Labour would be, if you have on the right of politics a party, in this case Reform, which, look, does appear to be in with a genuine shot of superseding the Conservative Party, I think it makes it harder for Labour to then argue to people on the left, well, come on, you've just got to stick with the trusted brand because that's how things work. And, basically, every major party would kill to get Theresa May's 2017 share of the vote these days. I mean, she got, well over 40%, and the fracturing since then has been enormous.
And then you get a conversation that goes on at the moment. In fact, I had this conversation again with someone last night, a Conservative, who was frustrated in this anniversary week of Labour being in government, that Labour are doing as poorly in the polls as they are. And you think, well, that's quite counterintuitive, that they would be irritated that their traditional principal rival is doing badly. But the logic goes like this. They say that if Labour had managed to hold on to its share of the vote that it managed at the general election, almost by definition, Reform would not be as high in the polls as they now are. Therefore, the gap, everything else being equal, between Reform and the Conservatives would be narrower, and the conversation would feel very different, particularly the big conversation happening for plenty of Conservatives at the moment within the party, which is an existential one, a fear of confronting a political reality that they have never previously confronted.
Right, should we get back to our format?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
We're going to gallop through the last year. And so, of course, that means we have to go back to election night. Chris, I'm going to be honest, that moment when the exit poll came out, my main memory was, aren't Laura and Clive sat very, very close together on that big table? Very, very close together. And then you gave your verdict on what you thought was going to happen that night. Can you remember what was going through your head at that point?
Yeah, I can remember there was an additional flutter in my heart as well. It's a big moment as a political journalist to be asked to do the kind of live, unscripted, ad-libbed television reaction to millions on an exit poll that appeared 30 seconds earlier. Now, mercifully, Henry was doing the equivalent on the radio at the same time. We'd been in a room, hadn't we, a couple of floors up, at about 20 to 10. In fact, it was about 20. It was meant to be at 9:30.
Curtis turned up 10 minutes late.
Where's John Curtis? Come on, what's he doing? And of course, they're doing all their numbers and they're making sure that they're comfortable with what they're at and all the rest of it. And he comes into this rather sweaty room, sweaty purely because there's a lot of kind of quite nervous people with pent-up, imminent broadcast energy within us. And he comes in and he reads through the numbers, and then a matter of minutes later, the two of us in television and radio are on. So yeah, I was aware, it feels like I excused the sort of rather self-centered initial thought, but of the magnitude of the moment in a broadcasting sense. And then you're trying to capture in as fewer words as possible, and in words that are universally understood, because this is a moment where politics is mainstream. It's not a moment, it's lots of times when politics frankly isn't, but at that moment it is. You want to capture the magnitude of the moment, and you heard the word in the newscast opening credits. I thought blimey was perhaps the one that perhaps best did it, because of the scale. That scale, particularly in seats, obviously clearly less so in share of the vote. That scale of victory in seats for Labour after so many defeats was, from their perspective at that moment, an extraordinary achievement.
And that moment where you deployed the blimey was fantastic, because I was in the radio theatre at Broadcasting House with hundreds and hundreds of newscasters, and we were basically just going to watch TV all night. And as soon as you said blimey, there was a massive round of applause and laughter because you'd used your trademark word. I think it was almost like people had bet money on that being what your reaction was, that they'd won big. Henry, we should remind ourselves, though, that we'd all spent the preceding 4 or 5 years saying, the mountain Keir Starmer has to climb to even get a majority of one is very big, it's going to be hard. And then he got, 100 times more than that.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to a couple of things. One is that he did a very, a phenomenal job as leader of the Labour Party, taking it from its worst defeat in 1935, since 1935, 5 years before, to going back into government. I guess the inverse of that speaks to how badly the Conservative Party stuffed it up, going from an 80-seat majority to their lowest number of seats ever. But I think also, and this is really pertinent for what we've seen unfold over the first year of this Labour government, is it shows how volatile politics is. You know, I'm increasingly obsessed with this idea, and I said this on Newscast last week with Paddy, that actually maybe something's just changed. You know, Boris Johnson won an 80-seat majority, which ought to have meant that we would be talking about his 6th year as Prime Minister right now, not Keir Starmer's first. And yet, within a couple of years of that, his MPs were disobeying him. Now, obviously, a pandemic happened and all sorts, but still, that's staggering. And now Keir Starmer, having won a majority of double the size of Boris Johnson's, I think it's the second biggest majority since the Second World War, just slightly smaller than Tony Blair's. And yet this week, we have seen, I mean, I'm jumping ahead of the format again, sorry Adam, but you know, this week we have seen that 165 majority just completely vanish in any meaningful sense.
Well, that's the end of the episode. We've got to the end of the year. Right, let's get back on track. We've got a couple of clips from the news and also from Newscast to help us kind of break this up into different sections. As you've seen, we're very good at doing that. So the first clip we're going to see is from the episode of Newscast that me and Chris did when Keir Starmer came into the studio, and we had a long chat with him, although Nick Robinson's had a longer chat for the 1-year anniversary than the 100 days. And this was, remember, on the eve of Labour were having a big investment summit where loads of bigwigs from around the world were coming in to invest billions of pounds in the UK, and he wanted to talk about that. But the problem he had was that lots of things had just gone wrong in those first 100 days. So let's see how Keir Starmer responded when we asked him about that.
In terms of the things we achieved that we wanted to achieve, the things we started, the legislation we've passed, that is all going absolutely according to the schedule that I set out. The investment is absolutely crucial, and we're not talking enough about it, in my view, because this is investment that's going to be measured in jobs in places across the United Kingdom, good, secure jobs for the future. So in that sense, I'm pleased. We've had headwinds of, I say, donation staff. I've had headwinds of the riots and disorder suddenly in the middle of the summer when I thought, right, I just need to get off for that week's holiday. We had terrible riots going on, and the situation internationally has been a sort of constant sort of pressure in terms of the decision-making that we've had to do.
That word headwinds, which actually turns out to be a gentle breeze compared to what came in the next few 100 days. Actually, just before we go on to talk about the substance, you could see in that clip there the fairly newish Newscast studio. I just want to test. See that's Newscast books on the bookshelf behind him. As many people here think they're real books, say aye. As many people who think they're not real books, say no. No, exactly. The fakest fake books you've ever seen. Anyway, so yeah, Henry, you did a documentary recently about Starmer's first year, and I was really struck by the sheer volume of texts you were getting from people going, we don't know what's going on. There isn't a plan. This much vaunted plan we're meant to have had from this woman called Sue Gray just isn't there. People sounded like they were tearing their hair out.
Yeah, and actually that anxiety began before Keir Starmer went into Downing Street, and I thought that was quite important to reflect in Starmer's Stormy Year, available now on BBC Sounds. And I read out, as you say, some WhatsApps that I received in the few weeks before, because Sue Gray, this former senior civil servant who'd come in amid some controversy about a year before, she'd been part of Starmer's core team, and then when the general election got called, she hived off. She literally went to physically a separate office. I think actually because of whoever its previous occupants had been, like it was an office decorated with Mickey Mouse regalia and something, which sounds like it added to the slight strangeness of it all.
Who was the previous occupant?
Well, that I don't know, but not a political party preparing for government, although if you ask some people, it wasn't subsequently occupied by a political party preparing for government. Anyway, even in that general election campaign, when she goes off to a separate office with a bespoke team to prepare for government, through the campaign, they'd occasionally come back together and they would show their work to some people from the sort of core campaign, and they weren't impressed. And that started to worm its way towards journalists, including me. And I read out this, in this documentary, I read out a message that I received from someone, that I sent to someone a couple of days before the general election, where I said, look, I'm hearing this stuff about the preparation for government being not up to scratch. Is that right? And they replied instantly saying, don't ask. I'm too worried to even talk about it. And look, I think those concerns were unequivocally, frankly, just observably vindicated. And I also spoke to Simon Case, the former head of the civil service, for this documentary, and he says, look, there were areas of government where they just hadn't done enough thinking. And I think a lot of that is understandable, actually, because I think it's a reflection of a cautious general election campaign. And you can use cautious as a pejorative, but it was the first Labour general election campaign since 2005 which had been successful. So clearly they did something right. But I think in a way that we didn't quite appreciate, the sort of strategic caution had meant that they hadn't actually done that much deep policy thinking.
Yeah, I think they had travelled light. They travelled light because they felt that that was politically savvy, to sort of make yourself the smallest possible moving target. Because frankly, Labour lose far more general elections than they win. So there's a psychology baked into those who've kicked around the movement for a long time, which is that they've lost one heck of a lot of general elections, including ones where they perhaps ought to have been able to win. Suddenly they're approaching one where they ought to win, that all of the evidence suggested they were likely to, but they still approached it with that caution because they felt that that was sort of savvy campaigning. They also did it, I think, partially because of that psychology, thinking the time we devote pre-election to preparing for government is time we could devote to campaigning to help us to win it. But then the speed, and Henry and I were following this and sort of mesmerised by it, the speed over the summer after they'd won, where it became apparent that they were really, really travelling sort of light in terms of detail. And on top of that, that there was this wild dysfunction at the heart of Downing Street, which seemed so, frankly, odd so early into a government. We'd been used to covering that sort of thing when a party or a collection of people have kicked around in power for a long time, and it's perhaps human nature that you're going to get those kind of fractures. But this was happening weeks into a government with a massive majority, with the thing going nuclear when we were explosively leaked the salary details of the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, which was a exercise from those within the government who wanted to see the back of her, and no more explosive way of doing it than leaking to us, of all people, those kind of details.
Why did you say of all people?
Well, because if the likes of Henry or I go on BBC output and we're saying something definitive, it carries, even in this big, noisy, multimedia world, it carries a clout and a weight that it's not that others don't have, but because of the number of outlets that we can broadcast on, we have perhaps to a greater extent than anyone else. That means, in my experience, some things that might get leaked to others don't come to us, and some things do. But that, when we were in possession of it and then trying to corroborate it over a couple of days in September of last year, it was obvious the scale of what those who wanted to share that information were seeking to achieve. And bluntly, it was to blow her out of the building. And it did. I mean, it did.
That was the final straw. I mean, she staggered on for a few weeks, but it was only going to end one way, and quite fast after.
Yeah, and obviously journalistically, we've got a job to do when we're in possession of information like that to corroborate it, which we did with other sources, and then to tell it in a direct and responsible way. And you know what then happens after that is for us to report on, but others will decide what happens. But what an extraordinarily explosive early couple of weeks, right at the heart. And the reason it mattered, this was right at the heart of government. The absolute central players at the heart of government around a novice Prime Minister, and you had this, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say, civil war within that building, within weeks. Now, you can have an argument about how brutal that was around an individual versus how efficient it was, as some see it, in sorting a problem, i.e. removing somebody and, as they would see it, putting somebody better attuned to the job in there. Although, fast forward a few months and we're now hearing briefings about the guy who now carries that title.
And I should just say that clip of Keir Starmer that we played from Newscast was after Sue Gray had gone. Yeah. So her departure was one of the headwinds that he referred to. Although I remember when we pushed him and getting him to name what the problems were, he sort of went, and personnel, and then moved on very, very, very quickly. Yeah. Now, in terms of actual government, and I suppose some ministers would say that they were ready. So, for example, Ed Miliband changed the law so you could have onshore wind farms in England that first week. So if he was here, he would argue he was ready to go in his policy area.
An MP from this very city, Louise Haigh, made an argument while she was in government that she cracked on with the whole business of the nationalisation of the railways as Transport Secretary before her time came to a premature conclusion.
And then in terms of other kind of policy decisions that have really mattered, around that time, so this is not a very good name drop, but at Joe Coburn's leaving party the other day there, the first person I bumped into on the way into the party was Liz Kendall. in
Working pension section.
Yeah, in happier times,
Still,
Sir Liz
just about,
Kendall.
I think.
And I was like, Liz, do you remember when you were on that episode of Newscast just before the general election? And I said, Liz, when you get into office, a few weeks after you got in, is Rachel Reeves going to say, oh, we looked at the books and the situation's much worse than we thought? And Liz went, no, that's definitely not going to happen. And then I reminded her that about a few weeks after they got into power, Rachel Reeves did an entire statement to Parliament about how the situation was worse than she was expecting. But Henry, that led to a really, really crucial decision, which was to axe the winter fuel payment for all but the poorest pensioners.
There's a couple of things going on, because actually, for months, if not actually probably more than a year before the general election, people who ended up in the government were telling me that strategically they were going to do something like that. Now, they weren't saying they were going to invent a black hole, because they say they didn't invent the black hole. It's there in black and white, and you know, that's a very real thing. But they were always going to make an argument about the inheritance being terrible. They were always going to essentially, they'd made a decision ages before the general election to go in and be gloomy, essentially. And the reason they'd done that was because they thought, looking back at 2010, David Cameron and George Osborne essentially won the 2015 general election in the days after the 2010 general election, when, especially helped by Liam Byrne's "There is no money left" note, they were able to say, the situation is worse than we thought, and by golly, we're now going to make some tough decisions to fix it.
And it's all Labour's fault at
exactly
the of the economy, and that was the argument.
And that is very consciously what Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer were trying to emulate. What I think what they now accept, they didn't appreciate, was that 2010 was, a year and a half after the financial crisis. People had had a difficult 18 months. By 2025, people had had a difficult 15 years. And that's a very different environment. And they now realise that, given their general election slogan was one word, change, they ought to have been a bit more hopey-changey, as I think George Bush once said about Barack Obama. So I think that is part of what was going on there. But then they would also say, well, there also was a specific amount of money they needed to make up. I mean, the winter fuel thing, and this is one of the things that came out in interviews I was doing for my documentary, I think what is now really widely acknowledged in government is that the biggest failing there was for it to essentially be the only policy for a few months.
Yeah.
If it had come at the same time as the budget, and there's some logistical reasons why that might have been difficult, because you needed to let pensioners know in advance, etc. But if it had come at the same time as the budget, so the winter fuel allowance is being removed from many pensioners, businesses are going to pay more on national insurance. And by the way, this is all funding increased investment in the NHS. I don't think it would have been anywhere near as controversial. Obviously, it still would have been very difficult for many pensioners. It would have been controversial. But it was the fact that it just hung over that miserable summer, riots and all sorts of reasons for that weren't in Keir Starmer's control, that I think made that such a devastating start for this government.
It just sat there like a giant toad on the political news agenda for months on end, having come out of nowhere. So it was the tail end of July last year. All of us who covered the general election were completely knackered and about to have a bit of a rest in August. And then, boom, out of nowhere, statement from the Chancellor about the fiscal backdrop, or words to that effect. And there comes the announcement. And then it sits there all the way until the budget in the autumn, which is an eternity in sort of news time. And Labour MPs who'd spent the previous, however long they've been a candidate, for some about a fortnight and for some years and years and years, being this alternative to a Conservative government where there was clearly a collective desire to eject. So they were the recipients of warmth, and they're the alternative. And suddenly their inboxes are deluged with, "You've taken my money away, and you never told me, and it's not fair," and all the rest of it. They were confronted by the realities of the trade-offs of government, which plenty now acknowledge they didn't communicate particularly well. Was it even necessary? Were they too gloomy? All of that kind of stuff.
And I just think when it comes to the disorder that followed the Southport attacks, just two observations there. One, it's that old adage from politics that you don't get much credit for things going well. So Keir Starmer, if he was here, would say that he managed to deal with that disorder in a proportionate, legal, grown-up, calm way, and that situation could have been much, much worse than it was, even though it was bad, especially for the families in Southport. And the second thing is, just thinking back to that clip, you can see he starts to make the joke about not being able to go on holiday, and then you see the gears turning. He's like, "Oh no, I can't make that joke," and then he lapses back into serious mode. It's just quite an interesting reminder of how when you're a frontline politician, you are walking a tightrope the whole time. Right, let's have another clip. This one isn't from Newscast, but Chris was there. This is that famous moment where Starmer went to the Oval Office to meet Donald Trump, and then he pulled out, surprise, surprise, a letter from the King.
It is my pleasure to bring from His Majesty the King a letter. He sends his best wishes and his regards, of course, but he also asked me to bear this letter and bring it to you. So can I present the letter from the King to you?
Thank you very much. Am I supposed to read it right now?
Yeah, please do.
I will do.
I've got to tell him what your reaction is, so I need to know. I need to know.
He is a great gentleman. A great gentleman.
I then shouted out, "What does it say?"
Yeah.
And he started reading it out. It's the most extraordinary thing, one of the most extraordinary things journalistically I've ever witnessed, being in that room and seeing the power of President Trump's stagecraft. That this is statecraft via stagecraft. That he does, his politics is kind of all on the record. It's all in front of the cameras. And as the Prime Minister's reflected in some of these year-in reflective interviews, the Prime Minister only arrived at the White House about 10 minutes before. Yeah. So he rolls up. He'd met Donald Trump before in the previous September, but he rolls up, shakes his hand, and then Donald Trump says, let's go out in front of the cameras and do a 45-minute shoot from the breeze, entirely freewheeling news conference. To Donald Trump's credit, he takes pretty much every question in the room. He doesn't know what we're going to ask. It feels anarchic, but actually it isn't, because once you start talking, the elbows have to be a little sharp, which I don't mind them being now and again. Beth Rigby's quite loud from Sky News, so I need to stand up for myself. But he'll take every question in the room. And there's an exercise in transparent questioning of a leader. That's admirable.
And we should say there, you see the two of them sat on the armchairs, but there's probably like 50 journalists and like 20 camera people off screen there.
And in the sofas that are at 90 degrees to the two chairs are 3 advisors and or ministers from the two sides. So from memory, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, was there on the American side, as was J.D. Vance, the Vice President. On the UK side, there was David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary. There was Morgan McSweeney, the Chief of Staff. And I forget, there might have been somebody else as well. And then this thing just rolls, and you don't know where it's going to go. And I asked the president, this was the day before Volodymyr Zelensky was in the same room, and I asked Donald Trump, do you still think President Zelensky is a dictator? And he said, did I say that? But he said it with such chutzpah. For a moment, I'm thinking, crikey, did he?
I got it wrong.
But in political communications terms, put aside whatever you may think of President Trump, in political communications terms, it was a genius answer, because he was neither doubling down nor resiling from what he was saying. There was a splash of self-deprecation there, which it wouldn't necessarily be the first character trait you'd associate with him, but that was definitely there. And I found myself thinking, I got a greater sense than I'd ever had from watching from a distance the kind of alchemy of which he sits at the centre that has projected him into the White House for 2 terms. You could see how he has done it, and the power of communication and stagecraft in that, at which he is brilliant.
And he made it into the Newscast opening titles, which I'm sure Donald Trump is very grateful for. Every time he listens, he does a little fist bump. Henry, Starmer's closeness to Donald Trump, it seems to have paid off. The UK's got a better, people argue whether it's a trade deal or not, and actually it's not really a trade deal because it just makes a bad situation less bad compared to what it was before.
It's better than any other country which has sought to mitigate the impact of Donald Trump's tariffs has managed. And I think that is a very clear, very tangible achievement of Sir Keir Starmer's statecraft. He has made a deliberate decision to be nice to Donald Trump in public and in private, because he thinks that will pay off, and that is a very clear example of somewhere where it has. And I actually think Keir Starmer has also, in a way that he hasn't quite done on the domestic stage, made and won the argument for taking that approach. In the UK, I think he has sort of done a sort of slightly meta argument he spends time defending the principle of palling up with Donald Trump, even though many people in the UK don't like him, including almost every member of the Labour Party, obviously. And I think he's made and won that argument. It's just on the domestic stage where things have been less smooth.
And seeing the theatrics of that moment, so you might have noticed from that video clip, the Prime Minister was tactile. He put his hand on the President's shoulder. That's not a sort of natural public thing for Keir Starmer to do. And people were telling me afterwards that he approached it like an appearance in court. What do you have to do to strike up a relationship in this public environment? So the theatricality of the letter, the patting on the shoulder. He used far more superlatives, Keir Starmer, in those exchanges for 40 minutes than he would normally do. And I can tell you that on the flight on the way out there, this is not surprising, but it was so evident, you could see it a mile off. They were really nervous. They knew the jeopardy of that. They'd seen President Macron of France in a few days before, and somebody said, well, remember, Keir Starmer's not French, because President Macron had really done the whole...
over him, yeah,
really done the touchy-feely stuff. But and they came away delighted. And then, of course, the day after, you had that moment with President Zelensky, and then a reflection in the months since from diplomats on both the French and the UK side that they concluded they spent far too much time worrying about their own trips to the White House and an insufficient amount of time preparing their ally in President Zelensky, who then went in for that now infamous encounter.
But what's especially impressive, is that Keir Starmer has managed to stick close to Donald Trump while a few days after that embracing Volodymyr Zelensky in Downing Street and trying to put that alliance back together, while actually doing a deal to get much closer with the EU, which Donald Trump loathes. There's a sort of jigsaw puzzle that he's piecing together. I think it is quite deft. The issue is, you don't get electoral dividends in the UK from being very good at foreign policy.
Do you have a theory, though, why Keir Starmer has turned out to be such a kind of master tactician on the world stage? Because international affairs is one of the things he'd just never done in his previous lives.
I do have a theory.
Yeah?
The electorate's not involved.
Oh, right.
You're just talking to other world leaders. No one's talking about the political pressures. No one's saying, well, actually, this Labour MP has this many PIP claimants in their constituency, Prime Minister. I think Keir Starmer does have... disdain's a bit strong, but I think he has something approaching disdain, or rather lack of interest, in the average constituency MP. It's just not his thing.
I mean, he said, didn't he?
Do you have what's your evidence for that?
Well, the fact that half of the 2024 intake, who you ask, have you ever met the Prime Minister? They say no. He's literally never exchanged a word with me.
And he said, didn't he? I've just remembered this, just listening to you, Henry. He said back in opposition whether he preferred Parliament or Davos, the Swiss resort where the sort of economic glitterati meet every February and drink champagne and go skiing and all that kind of stuff. And he was asked which of those two he preferred and said Davos.
Unhesitatingly.
Yeah, with that, yeah. And that tells you something. And he openly reflects on, coming to Parliament late in life, finding a lot of the quirks and mannerisms and approaches to the sort of political conversation domestically as a bit weird, as a bit odd. But ultimately, as a Prime Minister, you've either got to command that or it will command you. And the last week has been a case study in the latter.
Not that it's my job to defend Keir Starmer, but I just wonder if he were here, we would have brought him on by now, I think. Sorry, we're having such a good time just chatting.
Keep him waiting.
We've run out of time.
Got a country to run.
But just Henry, just on your point about but wouldn't Keir Starmer argue that when he was trying to reform the personal independence payments, he was as much thinking as the recipients of the payments as about the other taxpayers who have to pay for it. And he was trying to get a deal that was fair for taxpayers. And actually, he would argue it's a lot of Labour MPs who are ignoring the voters.
No, absolutely. But the point is that when he then tried to make that argument to Labour MPs, they said, "Nice to meet you." I mean, he didn't have a wellspring of loyalty on which to draw, and that's really important. He couldn't say, "Look, we've been through some stuff together, but trust me, my judgment is right." Now, the inverse of that argument, which lots of people in Downing Street have been making to me over the last few weeks, is, why on earth don't these people trust him? Hang on a second, he's the one who won the general election in 2024. He's the first Labour leader since Tony Blair to win a general election victory. Essentially, Who do these people think they are? Obviously, they didn't win their constituencies through personal endeavour. That's not how our general elections work. They won on the national coattails. But again, that is a dynamic that is harder for Keir Starmer to work in when he just hasn't, perhaps for understandable reasons given the world stage, but he just hasn't. I mean, our colleagues in the BBC's political research unit did a brilliant piece of work for us the other week. Keir Starmer has voted, just physically voted in the House of Commons, far fewer times in his first year as Prime Minister than almost any, well, actually, I think it was than any Prime Minister.
It's a handful of times.
Yeah, it was 7 until the other day.
And a couple of those were on those big conscience votes where people can leave their party affiliation at the door.
Just before we talk about the other U-turns, just Chris, can you give us an update on this idea of the coalition of the willing? At one point, it looked like we were pretty close to British troops being in Ukraine to police the kind of peace deal, and that now seems to have just evaporated, much like the peace deal itself.
Yeah, I mean, when you speak to people in government, they say it is still there. It is not as widely talked about, and it is one of the many kind of complex geopolitical and sort of diplomatic jigsaws that the Prime Minister's wrestling with, not least maintaining that kind of relationship with European neighbours, whilst also maintaining that dialogue with the United States when the President is so obviously, transparently loathing of the European Union as an institution. And you have a collection of European powers, many of whom are within the European Union, and then the UK attempting to see if they can arrive at something that might amount to a stable peace plan in Ukraine. I mean, clearly, and perhaps unsurprisingly, it's taking a longer a period of time than Donald Trump advertised in the election campaign that he thought he might, when he talked about being able to sort it out incredibly quickly. But then it is also true that the whole approach to diplomacy that Donald Trump brings, which is that sense of what on earth is he going to do next, does potentially have the capacity to shift things in a way that others might not be able to do.
Right, let's bring it back to matters fully domestic. And then one of the themes of the last few months has been, the U-turns on domestic policy. So Keir Starmer and the government changing their mind on various big things that they've done. For example, the winter fuel payment. And the first kind of big hint that was dropped that there was a U-turn coming on that was in the conversation Newscast had with Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, in number 11 Downing Street. And we had this conversation with her on a Monday, and then the U-turn kind of happened on the Tuesday or the Wednesday. So it went very quickly from her hints to it actually happening. And just a reminder of here's what Rachel Reeves said to me in number 11 that day.
I do understand the concerns that people have. We did increase the basic state pension, the new state pension, by over £450 just last month in April. We have put £25 billion into the NHS, which disproportionately is used by older people. But I will continue to listen to understand the concerns that people have raised. We are a government that listens, but we would always need to show where the money was going to come from if we're going to make any policy changes. So that would be part of any normal process.
That was Newscast first.
Yeah, that was a beautiful sunny day. So what did we do? Close all the windows, draw the curtains, and put some fake lights on. So listening then turned into acting. Although it's interesting, she sort of makes out that there'd be a sort of one in, one out thing there when it comes to public money, that it would have to be, if you restored the winter fuel payment, you'd have to fund it from somewhere else. That's not quite what happened, is it?
No, but it was interesting listening to that now, because that seems like an eternity ago, even though it's not that long ago.
That was the day that they'd done the reset deal with the EU.
Yeah, but just listening to the Chancellor's language there, and then reflecting on some of the conversations I've had and Henry will have had in the last few days since the about turn on benefits, I think we will see both publicly and then in the conversations the government has with its own MPs privately, a much sharper articulation of what the Chancellor was hinting at there, which is trade-offs. You can't spend every pound more than once. And effectively an argument that we're beginning to see already as far as the benefits cuts U-turn of this week is concerned, which is an argument that goes from the government to their own backbenchers. Look, okay, you've made the decision on this, but it comes with the price tag. And if you thought we were going to be changing the two-child cap on benefits, then there might not be the money for that. Now, they're not quite saying it as explicitly as that publicly, but they're effectively acknowledging, of course there's going to be a trade-off. And they want to have that more direct conversation with their own backbenchers because there's that feeling within government. And there would be, wouldn't there? But you can understand their frustration that they're trying to work out all of these trade-offs, and if we do X, we can't do Y. And as a backbencher, you can just say, well, I just don't like that, so I'm not voting for it.
Henry, when we talk about the massive U-turn on the changes to personal independence payments, have you managed to work out how Downing Street managed to get themselves into that position? Was it by accident? Was it carelessness? Or actually, did they think they could win the argument?
I mean, all of the above and plenty of other things, really. I mean, the initial failing that is now acknowledged all round is that Labour whips, so responsible for party discipline, but also more broadly intelligence, were jumping up and down for months, saying, guys, there's a lot of MPs who are very, very uneasy about this, and they weren't getting a hearing. That is now acknowledged as a failure. But what is not the case is that the Labour whips were saying, Dame Meg Hillier is going around collecting signatures for a reasoned amendment, and when it's published, it's going to have such a staggering number of signatures on it that actually it's going to instantly become apparent that the policy is going to have to change. Right?
And the reasoned amendment was the amendment that she tabled that would have just knocked out
it's
the
an
whole
amendment
thing
which
entirely.
actually bears no resemblance to the normal language meaning of the word amendment because it kills the legislation. And that's why no government has lost a vote at that stage of proceedings since 1986. And that is what the government was staring in the face of. What, though, I think really what clearly took government massively by surprise was that they conceded and struck a deal with essentially the ringleaders of the rebellion. And then it turned out that actually the individual rebels were much more unruly, and each for sometimes conflicting or different reasons were unsatisfied. And it made Tuesday, it was Tuesday, wasn't it? It feels like it was 6 months ago, but it was the most bewildering day.
It was like an hour-by-hour thing on the Tuesday.
Yeah.
Because, Henry and I and other colleagues are sort of sharing our own intelligence from what we're picking up. And there was clearly a jitteriness in government. They're thinking everything else being equal, if you get up to 70 or 80 rebels who are willing to vote against, you could lose. If you're a government that really, really does not want that to happen, then even if you get fairly close to that, you're going to be jumpy. And there was that sense of, oh, it's 50, maybe it's 55. Then there was talk of 60. Then someone said to me, we're thinking Downing Street had been told it was 75, 80. And then, hey, presto. So that was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So on that afternoon, you had Liz Kendall, the Work and Pension Secretary, standing up in the House of Commons and explicitly setting out the policy as it was. And 3 hours later, and remember that's only half the policy because they junked the previous half the week before, and by 5 o'clock they junked the substantial part of the rest of it. Not the whole thing, but the substantial part of the rest of it. Again, you were seeing in plain sight the shredding of the government's capacity to get this pretty central bit of legislation through its first Commons stage with a majority of working majority of 165. It's extraordinary.
That was Tuesday. Then, of course, Wednesday is the now infamous Prime Minister's Questions, where Rachel Reeves looked very upset. We've talked about it quite a lot already this week, Chris, but I just wonder, at the end of the week, now the dust has settled a bit on that, we've also seen her back out and about. She was there at the launch of the NHS 10-year plan yesterday. Just what's your kind of more settled take on all of that now that it's a few days past?
That was an extraordinary moment. I mean, I was in the press gallery watching it, looking down on the government benches, so sitting above the Conservative benches. And look, in simple terms, that doesn't happen normally, does it? That's the point. And those images were flashing around. We could see the tears coming down her face. I was very conscious that in the immediate moment, we should be very careful about how we calibrate our reporting of it. Not that we shouldn't, of course you've got to report it. And it's clearly extraordinary in news terms, and it's going to make a lot of headlines. But I was very conscious to our team that at that point, we shouldn't even assume that she's upset. Could it be an allergy or some reaction to something? Then obviously we're asking her team what's happening here relatively quickly, albeit perhaps within half an hour or so, which seems a long time at the time. We were told that there were personal reasons that were a contributory factor. Henry and I and others are charging around Parliament trying to find out what's going on. There's briefly, about an hour or so, there was a real sense of, because the markets were moving in response to it, could the Chancellor be about to leave office? Could she be about to resign or be sacked? And also, we were establishing that there was another factor in all of this, which is she had a run-in with the Speaker on her way into the chamber. And obviously the context is one where her job had just got much harder because of the benefits of Boughton. And then it's about trying to report it in a calibrated and responsible and human way, because as we then had confirmed, you know, she was upset. And so you have to, I think, always kind of broadcast in that way that is human and calibrated. Yeah.
Right, I've asked enough questions. Let's get some from our audience here in Sheffield. We've got some microphones doing the rounds, hopefully, and hopefully they work. Hopefully we brought some batteries. I think Jordan is going to ask us a question. Hi, Jordan.
Hi, guys.
Hello.
I'm 22, so all I've ever really known is political chaos. From Brexit to COVID to Liz Truss and her lettuce, and now, even though I am a Labour member and a voter, a government that seems not to really have a message. Was it always like this? And do you feel like it will ever get better? And just a quick bonus question as well, while I'm here. Normally you guys are sat here and the politicians are on stage. How does it feel having it the other way around?
Terrifying.
Well, I mean, as a fellow 22-year-old, I don't know if I can even answer that question, Jordan. Henry, why don't you, Professor Zeffman, take us away.
I mean, my political journalism career basically, I became a political journalist for the Times in 2016, a month before the EU referendum, so it almost entirely covers the chaos years. But I do remember a few weeks after Leave won that referendum, and there were a crazy few days, which you won't remember being 22, where Boris Johnson was going to become leader of the Conservative Party and Michael Gove was running his campaign, and then Michael Gove ditched him and ran himself, and Boris Johnson withdrew, and then Andrea Leadsom, who no one had ever heard of, might have been about to become Prime Minister, and then she withdrew, and then Theresa May became Prime Minister. And I remember on one of those nights, one of my then colleagues, who was much more seasoned, turning to me and saying, you know, these have been the most exciting few days of my time in political journalism. So Henry, it's all downhill for you from here. And he was wrong. I mean, it just stayed like that. And from what I know of more experienced political journalists, something has changed. Probably does. It's both reflected and probably driven and catalysed the volatility that we see nationally. But then also there's international tumult.
Yeah, I mean, I remember trying to explain to my now 9-year-old daughter, so was born in 2015. You know, you hope. Certainly when your dad's a political reporter, that, you know, they'll know the name of the Prime Minister when they're a young little nipper. And of course, you know, they were changing every 5 minutes. It's changed. We had this conversation, we had them on Newscast, because I was realising that I was saying to my daughter, there's another new Prime Minister, you know, blah, blah, blah. Adam and I were born in the same year, in 1980, and we were...
I'm not 22, sorry.
We were 27, so in 2007, before we were living with the fourth Prime Minister of our lifetimes. And so we were 27 before we were on Prime Minister number 4. I'm 3 years into being the BBC political editor, and I'm on my fourth.
Oh, even he can't remember.
Prime Minister. Yeah. So that speed of change that you speak of is very real, and all the evidence suggests, least surprising observation of the evening here, that it's the new normal.
Do you know, me and Chris went to journalism school together, and our term started the week after 9/11, and like the world just felt like really scary, and like it was really tilting on its axis.
I did my last summer job shift on a campsite in the Yorkshire Dales on September the 11th, 2001, and we were starting at journalism school, weren't we, a matter of days later. And yeah, in many senses, from then, and then the Iraq War in the year that you were born, and then on to the financial crisis and the years of coalition and referenda and prime ministers every 5 minutes and elections every 5 minutes. It's never stopped since, really.
And to answer your question about what it's like being up here, I mean, it's just home. It's home from home, because we're amongst friends, up here and out there. Right, have we got another question? Let's go to somebody on this side of the room. I also wonder what department was then. Did anyone used to shop here in this shop? What department did this used to be? Was it pants? It was beauty. And looking at the front row, it still is. Right. So my colleague Schiller's got the microphone. It's going. Hello. What's your name?
I'm Andy. Hello.
Hi, Andy.
So I'm much older than Jordan. So I've seen the Labour Party talk about reinventing itself or changing itself, I think, at least 4 times, 4 different leaders. And this tends to happen a lot. And a lot of it seems to be about their past. They worry about tax and spend, so they get worried about the money. They worry about communication and too much spin, all that kind of stuff. And is it how much of what's happening now is that they've just got trapped in what's happened before? And can you get out of that?
Oh, that's a philosophical question.
It's a really
Where do you want to
good
start?
question.
Do you know what's interesting about it? My observation that's sort of a bit related to that is listening to Nick Robinson's interview on political thinking with Nick Robinson, with Starmer, and they're talking about the change of policy on whether to have a national inquiry on grooming gangs. Mm-hmm. And Starmer's like, well, no, I asked Louise Casey, Baroness Casey, to look at it and to tell me what we should do to make sure that we were doing the right thing. She looked at it. She even changed her mind and said, actually, there should be a national inquiry. So Keir Starmer, changed my mind too. He's trying to kind of rewrite the rules of politics to make a U-turn not a bad thing. That's an example of kind of what Andy's getting at, about being, are you trapped in old ways or can you create new things?
Possibly. I mean, I've been reflecting in the last few weeks about that word U-turn and the extent to which it's perceived as a pejorative and therefore the extent to which it is reasonable for us to use it. And I think it is reasonable that the change of mind on a statutory inquiry into the grooming gangs was a different process and perhaps less worthy of the U-turn label than the other two, so Windsor Fuel and the benefits. But ultimately, it was also a change of mind, and it was a month in which there were 3 of them. And so it's that old notion, I think, that if you are giving somebody a lift somewhere and you have to make 1 U-turn, that's unfortunate. But if you make 3 on the same journey, they might wonder if you know where you're going. And that's that bigger picture point to which you speak to about, is this a government projecting a sense of direction, whatever that direction might be? And you don't have to scratch far within the Labour Party, including at a senior level, to find people who fret that the answer to that is no, that they're not being sufficiently clear about their direction.
Right, let's be super efficient. And if you want to ask the last question, put your hand up and one of my colleagues will come and find you. And while we're doing that process, so hands up please, while we're doing that process, Henry can make his point.
Oh, okay. Well, no, I was just going to say, I think it was a really good question. I think actually what Andy's absolutely right about is perhaps one of the reasons Labour's general election campaign was so pared back, smallest possible target and all of that, was because of their previous errors in election campaigns, making too many promises, especially too many spending promises. But look, they are clearly going to end up increasing taxes in a big way this autumn, so I think they'll be right back where they started.
Right. The newscast mastermind, Chris Gray, who helps make this podcast the success it is, has handed the microphone to somebody.
Hi, I'm EC from Sheffield.
Hello.
So, given all the U-turns, what's Rachel's next move, particularly in relation to public sector pensions, which would have a big impact in this city? Thank you.
These are great questions.
Yeah.
By which I mean I'm buying myself some time before I offer.
I mean, the thing is, like, reforming public sector pensions, that would be a big deal.
And as you hint at in your question, one with geographical focus in those places with a significant proportion of the population to whom that would be a direct impact. I mean, look, this is the big picture reflection off the back of this last week, dominated by those images with the tears, is that the Chancellor's job was already incredibly difficult. A, because of the backdrop, the lack of growth that goes back years and years, as we've reflected, the volatile nature of the international picture, the political restrictions she's imposed on herself as far as tax is concerned, which was part of the argument about being seen to be fiscally credible before the election. Then the fiscal rules that she's imposed on herself, which she doesn't like us describing as self-imposed, because she thinks that they're the nature of the market, but they are self-imposed. She's choosing to do it in order to project a sense to the market of being credible. And then this benefits thing comes along, and that blows a £5 billion hole in the books. So, as Henry was saying, look, a lot of arrows point in the direction of taxes, in particular that whole business of the thresholds on income tax that over time people punch through inflation and pay rises, widely seen as a stealth tax. It's a massive generator of revenue, but then also looking at other things, whether it's pensions, whether it's ISAs, there's all sorts of things that they'll be looking at, whilst also keenly aware, as some of our questioners have reflected, that the critique that is lobbed at Labour government since time began is one of, tax and spend and all the rest of it, which is seen by many through a sort of pejorative prism. Final thought, I've said this before, but I'll say it again, it's not easy governing in the 2020s. Ask Rachel Reeves, ask Jeremy Hunt, ask Rishi Sunak, ask Keir Starmer.
And ask Henry for a final word.
Well, I think regardless of what Rachel Reeves did while sitting next to Keir Starmer on Wednesday, actually the biggest problem for her remains what it was a minute before Prime Minister's questions, which is that a large number of Labour MPs have a different view of what this government should do on the economy to her view and to Keir Starmer's view. And that is a fundamental tension which is going to have to be resolved one way or the other sooner rather than later.
And we are 2 minutes over our allotted time at this podcasting festival. And there's some very big names who are going to be taken to the stage over the next few days. So we should probably vacate it. Don't give us a round of applause. Give yourselves a round of applause for the great questions. And I heard some very good oohs and ahs when Chris and Henry made good points. So thank you very much for having us here in Sheffield, everyone.